We've had some great feedback, and I'll touch on that on this call as we formally open. By the way, hi, Brad, Marcel. It's good to have you here. Um, Antitrust policy notice. We have this wonderful start of every call. Here we go. The Linux Foundation has an antitrust policy. You'll find it on our website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. The purpose of the antitrust policy, we show it at the beginning of every meeting, is to help set the context for how we discuss collaboratively and we can work together in a manner that is going to make sure everyone's comfortable and efficient. Now, this meeting has a very regular agenda. We always do the same thing in terms of structure, and that makes it very predictable. This allows people to know precisely what they're getting when they come here. What you're getting is a brief overview of the news in the last couple of weeks. We do some work on standards and core material. We have space to either just talk about or work on reference material as well, which supports our standards. We have a space for any other business where you or any party can raise any topic relevant to this project, and then we close the meeting. Now, it's a small group tonight, and we're not going to run a long meeting because we don't have that many open issues to process right now. We're pending on our chair of the spec work group, and this call is the spec work group's call. We're pending on Chris returning to his normal chairing duty. He's out on sick leave. So we're clearing up existing issues and we're clearing the deck, preparing for Chris's return. So we're going to run a meeting that tidies up a little bit and provides some context, both for the people who are live, but also the people who are watching the recording. The news recap, it's very relevant to what I just talked about. We always start the news recently with an overview of project meetings. As you can see, it's a pretty busy week this week. We just had the AI study group call. The recording is still pending. Zoom is preparing it, and it'll be released in the next few days. That was a workshop for 2 hours, trying to deal with some of the complexities of AI management. It's been an energetic and active domain for people to talk about this topic. And we'll see how it begins to narrow down the commonalities as time goes by. A lot of ground has been covered in the last few months. We're on the monthly call right now. And throughout the week, we'll have some of our very regular and interesting calls. The automation work group will meet tomorrow, Wednesday, the 5th of June. That's where they talk about tooling. And Marcel, who's on the line today, has been one of the driving forces alongside Oliver Fent from Siemens in a lot. We've had some really cool webinars coming out of this work group, and we've had some really interesting meetings. Just to cite an automation-related webinar, it was mentioned on our last call. It's not one of the news items for this call, but you'll find it in our webinar list. We've had a webinar on something called About Code, which has released all of the technology as open source, supported by open data as an end-to-end open approach to SCA, which is one of those things we talked about for years, and it's good to see coming into operations. The education work group meets tomorrow. They have a bunch of things they're closing off. A couple of weeks ago, the release of the SBOM quality guide started. We've seen the markdown version out last week. There's going to be the PDF and printing versions out this week in English, Japanese, French, and simplified Chinese. The SBOM quality guide is designed to answer questions like, what do I need in an SBOM to make sure I meet the NIST requirements? And if I'm using SPDX, the minimums for that. What do I need to see from my suppliers? Comes out of Telco Workgroup, which is meeting on the 6th of June. Telco, especially, we saw Ericsson, Nokia, and KDDI doing a lot of work in producing that document, which they then rightly decided is applicable to everyone. So they worked with the education work group to get that out. Telco is still maintaining that document, and they're already working on the second generation, as we tend to do. Once one is out, we start on the next. So joining their meetings goes beyond telecommunications. You can talk about SBOM quality. They're actively editing. All of the OpenChain meetings, not just the international ones, but also quite a few of the regional ones appear on our global calendar. So you'll find that at Participate. Now, the AI study group, as I mentioned, the meeting for June just happened. The recording is being processed by Zoom. It'll be out in the next couple of days. Meanwhile, you can catch the prior meeting, which was a monthly recap for North America, Asia. That's out there. It's fully recorded, and that recaps the meeting before that, the workshop before it for North America and Europe as well. So you can easily get up to speed regarding where our AI study group is at. And as usual, I'll start to put these relevant links in the chat. That's the link if you want to go have a look at that recording. We have had some workshops. So on the 31st of May, there was a workshop held in Shenzhen. This is with Huawei, SegTrend, and OpenChain. And about 40 people got together to talk about supply chain security and compliance. We had law firms presenting on cases in China. We had companies talking about how they manage their supply chain. And in short, at one of the spaces that we have at relatively regular intervals to bring people together and think about stuff. The AI study group does its workshops online. In China, we frequently have face-to-face workshops. This workshop is particularly important because it also will be the last one for a while for a good reason. We've had ByteDance IP department and OSPO, one of the representatives has volunteered to replicate the structure of meetings we've seen in Japan and Korea. So essentially bi-monthly community meetings. And starting at the end of June, it'll be announced tomorrow. On the 28th of June, there'll be a meeting at the ByteDance offices in Beijing. At the end of July, it looks like there'll be a meeting at an automotive company in Shanghai to get this idea started that we bring together 10 to 20 people from companies, have 2 case studies, have a guided discussion and networking time over a period of around 2 hours. Low cost, face-to-face, high on communication value, and cheap and easy to present, because all we do is get a room at someone's offices, we get together, and we have a targeted, efficient conversation. So this workshop in Shenzhen was the last bigger event for a while. We'll have 2 starting meetings for the China study group in a regular, more informal context. And then bi-monthly, they'll continue on the same type of schedule as Japan and Korea, which has proven extraordinarily efficient. The 190 companies or so in Japan in the work group have found a lot of connections in the last few years in running that. Korea, we have around 100 people from around 80 companies. It's been very similar. China, we have 320 representatives from approximately 280 companies. But it's tended towards larger event and then everyone goes home and doesn't talk again until the next event. So we're looking at shifting the needle on that. I just wanted to flag it because it's pretty cool. And also, we just had a few hours ago an event in Taipei. This event was with Open Culture Foundation, featured policymakers, industry professionals, and so on, getting together to talk about international trends across multiple industries and how they're applicable in a market like Taiwan, where you have an awful lot of manufacturing companies like MediaTek, Foxconn, and so on. A very productive meeting, and it will continue with policymakers face-to-face tomorrow. Webinars. The webinar I wanted to flag for you this time is AI. We did an AI webinar in conjunction with the Open Forum Europe think tank. This was about the EU AI Act, the first legislation around AI explicitly. It's the second of 3 webinars we're doing in collaboration with OFE. Earlier, we did the CRA, And this month, a little bit later, we'll do the EU Product Liability Act. These are part of our corpus of now around 90 something webinars covering all types of topic. And we're touching CRA, AI Act, and Product Liability Act because those are topics companies have flagged as of high interest to them in supply chain management. Okay, so lots of nice strategic stuff and some positive news in the last couple of weeks in terms of the type of engagement we're seeing. It's obviously very important for us that strategic people are talking about strategic topics with a mind to investing in these type of solutions. Pulling back to work on standards and core material, which is why we're here as a project. As usual, everything is easily listed and discoverable online. I'm going to put this into the chat. The links to security and licensing are here, the open issues. For context, a couple of people maybe might be new to where we're at. We've been closing off open issues quite quickly, not because of a rush, but because of momentum on these calls. We've been closing off open issues because we're about to go into a public comment period on the drafts of the potential next generation for both licensing and security. Now, just to be very clear, we're in no rush to update the ISO standards, but we are developing them, as always, in the open. We've gone through a process over the last 18 months, in general, of collecting issues and talking through topics inside our ecosystem. We've been closing off all of the open issues in the recent period because soon we'll do a 6-month public comment period going outside of our ecosystem and saying to people anew all over the world, have a look at these drafts and let us know what you think. So with the leadership of our chair, Chris Wood, that's what we've been up to. Chris has been out for a couple of weeks for personal reasons, and he will return later this month, is on target, at which point we'll be moving into the public comment period and so on and so forth. When it comes to what we did in the last call, it was the North America Asia call. It was towards the end of May. We were doing one issue on license compliance and one issue on security assurance, closing off some of the last issues on both topics. We closed the license compliance issue. The security issue we kept open because we closed it on our call, and then we had a comment in which reopened it temporarily, but only for a 2-week period. I've put the links into the chat if you want to see what those issues were and how we discussed them. And of course, if you look at the recording, which I'm also putting in the chat, that recording has us doing it live. On this call, it's follow-up time. So the issue that was closed and then reopened on security assurance is scheduled, as per our last discussion, to be closed on this call. Now, that's not entirely uncontroversial because the person who wanted it reopened and had a comment was Chris, but the resolution was proposed and put on a time scale. And it's a resolution that, as you'll see in a minute, is not based on something controversial, and it is something that we can reopen later as necessary. But at the same time, the messaging on the scheduling we created regarding closing these issues and heading towards the public comment period is quite important to keep some momentum on. We have a new issue which was open for the license compliance draft spec as well to cover. Let's dive in to this. I want to show you the security assurance one. So this is the topic that we actually closed on a call, and then we reopened, and we're going to close again on this call. Chris might come back and reopen it later, but we're going to close it on this call. Long story short, we have been working on some language in the reference section of the spec. So we were talking about security testing, and we were talking about how to improve the language compared to what it is in the current ISO standard without becoming too burdensome. But to go all the way back to the very beginning, security testing in the ISO version of our standard is quite lightweight. Okay, it's saying that we check, we have a process for checking software to understand current and future management regarding known vulnerabilities. Now, under discussion, we decided that that language, while sufficient to run with our goals, is not necessarily descriptive enough in the reference section to be as useful as it could be. So we finessed it and got to a certain point, expanding on the topic to the point of not just referencing do something here, but referencing do something here, and here are examples of what you do. For instance, static application security testing and dynamic application security testing. The fundamentals of that were built out by multiple people, especially Chris, obviously, because he's our main security buff. And we tried to get the balance between the amount of language and references while not making it too heavy. Now, again, let me just stress, this is in the reference section, not the requirements. So we're looking at helping people understand, what do we mean when we say security testing? Now, Chris wasn't so happy about one word here, the phrase that doing this type of analysis for security testing, we said it should include blah, blah, blah. And Chris reopened the issue because he felt should is not sufficient from the language point. He would like to use a phrase like must. And he was concerned that saying should would perhaps not meet requirements for secure programming as per US and EU regulations. So in other words, he wanted to potentially make the language stronger to ensure it explicitly would cover potential regulation requirements. This, as you can see, was noted in the context of our discussion. And it started to get quite verbose, and I do apologize for that. But the short version is that we use a set of words based on IETF in both licensing and security spec. We're using a set of words from them to help us set context of how we write our specs. So must, must not, required, shall not, should not, recommended, not recommended, may, and optional, and defined interpretations of those. So the idea is that we're narrowing down how people can read this stuff. Now, in the case of the item that Chris raised, he wanted should, which basically means recommended, to be replaced with must, which would be required. And that's a valid point. It may be necessary for regulations, but there are open questions. For instance, does the NIST SP 800-218, which we reference in this, does that include these requirements or not? And perhaps most pertinent to our discussion, there was a reason that we didn't include must, and there was a consensus from multiple parties that should was more appropriate where we used it. Because, and again, just to stress, this is not a requirement, this is a definition. So the reason that we used should was because we didn't want anyone to interpret it as a requirement. And several parties raised a concern that if the phrase was must, that could be interpreted, despite the fact it's in the reference section, not in the requirements, it could be interpreted as a requirement of the standard. So this was the concern, and that's why we used should. And that's why this issue was reopened. Chris made a point, and it was reopened and given 2 weeks for people to consider the point. But we haven't had any strong input concurring with the use of the word must in this definition section in the context of what we're doing at this juncture. And I just wanted to pause there and see if anyone had any questions. And I know I've gone back and forth in explaining this. There was a lot. So I wanted to make sure that you got a briefing that set context and why we landed on the language that is in the chat and was shown up here, security testing, why we landed on that language and why we haven't landed on either language and why this issue is closed in this 2-week period. Does anyone have any questions about this? All right.
No questions. Maybe I think I was in one of these discussions. So yeah, we had quite a lengthy discussions there, and I think one point what Shane you didn't mention was that I think in some of these discussions we talked about, okay, now we have the DAST and SAST, etc., but who knows what comes tomorrow.
Yeah. Yes. And that's a very good point. We don't know what comes next, which also made the kind of the conceptual approach of, I think, Yari, this is my interpretation, that one of our conceptual approaches was in this reference section, we're painting a picture, but we're not trying to lock things down too
Yep,
much.
indeed.
So the summary is a bit like this, but not definitely that, and only that. So, Chris's concern is still on the table. The time scale for other parties to jump in and echo the concern has expired. And therefore, given our usual process, because our consensus on the call from multiple parties was to go in direction A, someone raised concern B, other parties have not concurred with concern B in the time period necessary. And the context of this is a reference item, not a change to requirements. In this type of situation, our habit is to close the issue with the proviso that if anyone feels really strongly about this, they're welcome to reopen the issue in the future. And it's a lot of time to spend on saying we're keeping what we did before this thing is closed. But it's important that this record exists on this recording, that people know how we came to this decision, why, and they also know that they're free to reopen this as needed. There's a hanging thread here with your question to Chris about NIST SP 800-218. If he comes back with an answer to that, which changes the context, then we might look at this on future calls. Otherwise, this is one of the last issues on security assurance spec. We're down to 3 open before we go to potentially the public comment period. Thank you for your attention on that. We're moving to the license compliance spec. We have a new issue from Yari, who was bringing up something based on a previous discussion on something else we closed. It's a very simple item, but it could have profound implications in terms of introducing a change to requirements on our spec. So the long story short, we have a schedule of every 18 months, double checking if you meet the requirements of our standards. And Yari pointed out that maybe we can go to a yearly cycle. Now, some of the original people who wrote the first licensing spec are on this call. So I'll give you some context and please feel free to jump in. If I recall correctly, one of the reasons for the 18-month cycle was to make sure that it was at a period which wouldn't lead to people checking a box at an annual review and not actually double checking that they meet the requirements of this standard. And perhaps there is a consideration that that was a product of the time when it was, 2015, 2016, open source was perhaps less understood and less central to business operations compared to today. So the question is, given that we're a little bit unusual with an 18-month check, if people still meet the requirements of the spec, should we look at having an in-cycle, an annual or even a 24-month review for companies to check if they meet the requirements of the spec? And that's an open question. That would change one of the requirements from 18 months, check if you still meet the things you need to meet in these standards, or move it onto a 12-month or potentially a 24-month cycle, which would align with the type of cycle we see in some other standards from ISO and other parties. Does anyone have any opinions on this one way or another? If no one has opinions on it, what happens next is that we've had a proposal for an adjustment based on a rationale. If there's no disagreement with that proposal, then the proposal will be potentially included in the draft so it can go to our steering committee for formal consideration. And that's something that perhaps, you know, that doesn't mean we're going to change the standard, but it does mean that we'd be moving from chatting about it into our steering committee, exploring it more seriously and voting on it as a potential change to the requirements of the ISO standards in the future. That's why, if you have a concern, it's a very good time to pipe up and let us know. Otherwise, we'll be folding it into the drafts and taking it into the more formal process. Okay, if there's no strong feelings about it, we'll take it to the steering committee. So we'd actually incorporate it into the drafts, and then that's what will go before the steering committee in the end of June, around the next board meeting. And that doesn't mean, by the way, in case anyone's watching this recording and isn't clear on how we develop these standards, that doesn't mean we're changing the requirement of the standard today. What it means is we're going to change the draft document to include this idea because no one has objected to it and it seems rational to align with annual reviews because perhaps the decisions we made 8 years ago based on market maturity and out of cycle review are no longer necessary. That idea will go before the steering committee, who will formally consider it for potential inclusion in a future update to the ISO standards. So there's still a long path to go. And this is the process we always take to make sure that everyone has plenty of time to comment. So no one's speaking. Does that mean no one has a strong feeling? And we proceed. I'll give it 10 seconds and then I'm going to say we're doing it.
Just giving my thumb up there.
All right. So what I'll do is I'll edit the draft license spec with the change in the draft edit to 12 months so that the steering committee will formally see that and talk about it as one of the items on their agenda. And with that, uh, cycle, so 12-month cycle, placed. 0.0. All right, so this issue is being closed. Now, again, rule is you can always reopen an issue if you consider it and you're concerned, or your colleagues consider it and they're concerned, or your competitors and your peers, or your friends. But the issue is now closed and basically will be kicked towards the steering committee for their consideration. All right, that is actually all of our business on the specs for today.
Uh,
Uh,
Shane, like if you go back, because there's this, let's say, second subject there on the issue 71.
oh, yes.
Like how does it work then, with this subcommittee part there?
Okay. Okay. Right. Great question. Okay. So the second part of this was a question that was raised. There's a whole bunch of organizations that came to us and said, we're using your ISO standards. Can you, or we want to help with your outreach. Can you include our logo on your website? As part of that, we want to encourage our customers and suppliers and our peers to use the standards too. Question from Helio over at Cariad, and Yari, thanks for catching this. I must admit, I'm fading fast at 12:40 here in Taipei. Um, Helio flagged, what if companies that have their logo on our website are no longer OpenChain conformant? Because we don't check conformance. We're not a certification body. So what if organizations who happen to be listed on our website no longer use the standard, no longer conform to the standard? Um, what happens then? The answer to that is that that's a question that probably needs to go to the governing board. And rather than going into the governing board for a motion, it needs to go somewhere for a discussion. And the governing board has a strategy subcommittee, which meets every so often. I think it's meeting sometime next week. And it's basically a space for a couple of hours for board members, plus other interested parties like yourself. You'll find the meeting on the global calendar, I believe, um, to chat about a strategic topic like this. And they chat about topics and then they prepare a short report for the board, which allows the board to essentially, every board member who's interested in a topic can join the subcommittee and chat about it. And then the board as a whole can get a quick summary so that they can make decisions. Now, the strategy subcommittee is new. We created it relatively recently. And that means that, we're still in the very early days of it. But this type of topic, OpenChain displays logos when companies say they're conformant. What happens if companies are no longer conformant? What should OpenChain do? That's exactly the type of thing for the strategy subcommittee. And thanks to Yari for flagging it right now, I will be taking that to Matthew, who is chairing the strategy subcommittee, and putting it on his agenda for his next call on the topic. So I'm just going to add an FYI. Okay, strategy subcommittee. Okay, so I'm sending that to Matthew so he can add it to their discussion. And that means that that idea raised by Helio, who's on our board, will go to the board strategy subcommittee for informal discussion and a report to the board who can then think about it and think if they need to take an action here. Thank you, Yari. Prevents me from having to rediscover that later, and it ensures we're efficient. Reference material. There's actually no news from me on the education work group because their meeting is, I think it's tomorrow. So they have a monthly meeting. But since their last meeting, at which they set some completion dates for material. The SBOM quality guide they're working on has been released in Markdown. The updated training slides and the updated supplier education leaflet are complete and ready for release. We thought that we'd get them out at the end of May, but a few tweaks were made. The most recent one today to the supplier education leaflet on nothing too large, but just finessing because we hit the final release versions and people said, maybe we can improve a bit here. Anyway, they've been working on a tremendous amount of material. In the beginning of May, final cycle, supplier education leaflet, updated training slides, SBOM quality guide. SBOM quality guide is out in Markdown. PDFs should be coming later this week for printing and easy email attachments. Training slides and supplier education leaflet, basically done, basically ready to roll. Next couple of weeks, you'll be seeing those promoted. And education work group is working on other stuff right now, building new explainers for different business departments, taking video summaries of various aspects of our project and other business process management for open source that were created in the UK. We're about to publish those across our global channels. And finally, what's coming up next is maturity modeling, where reference maturity modeling will be made available, not to be prescriptive, but to help answer questions that companies raise of when I'm trying to improve my compliance program, how do I measure that or set expectations? Well, maturity models. Most maturity models are provided by companies, providers such as PwC or Deloitte, other companies have plenty of maturity models. What we haven't seen are maturity models that are super easy to access based on our ISO standards. And it just so happens that Orcro's about to give us exactly that under CC0. So that's exciting, but that's a topic for next month. Any other business? Okie dokie. Any other business, you can bring up anything related to anything that might be referencing our project charter activities, a trusted supply chain. It's a placeholder to ensure that voices can be heard and raise new topics, but it's not essential to do so. And it seems no one is planning to do so today, at which point then we close this meeting. And with great thanks to everyone, my sincere apologies. I've talked nonstop in this meeting. Apart from Yari, we were going through some formalities. One of them on security was about reference material, and that definitions thing was not critical, obviously, to requirements, but it was a discussion that had a lot of legs. People had a lot of opinions. So it was important that we closed that off formally and how we did it. On the licensing standard, where we just talked about the cycle of double checking conformance from 18 months to 12, that is a change of requirement. And while we didn't have a big discussion about it, it was very, very important that we explicitly covered it on this call, on this recording, on this date, so people will know precisely the moment when we introduced that and said we're no longer chatting, we're moving it to the steering committee for their formal consideration of a potential change in a potential update to an ISO standard that thousands of companies are using. So your presence on this call has been very important. Whether you've actively spoken on the call or simply listened, your presence has validated our process and provided an audience to engage with and comment on the standards at any juncture as they wish. People watching this recording, it's exactly the same. You can join our next call. You can go to our GitHub or you can use our mailing lists. It turns out, thank you, Ruhi, just saying it was great to attend. I do appreciate you being here. I did notice as we close the meeting, there is sort of kind of an any other business from Yari. Upstream Live. Okay, so yeah, Thanks, Harry. That's an interesting one. I haven't registered for it, but Tidelift, which is an organization that helps get funding into open source projects, has a conference that covers a lot of strategic matters regarding sustainability and open source. Conference happens tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern, as Yari flagged. So it could be something fun for you to attend if you want to get a feel, not on our specific topic per se, not the compliance, not the security, not the business process management per se. Of course, they'll mention aspects of this, but the scope of strategic open source, well, why not? I believe it's free and it's open to everyone, so it can be useful. Thanks, Harry.
Yeah,
Good flag.
it's free, and you can see that basically the sessions they are available, recorded, later on, so you don't need to follow it live anyway. But you can normally, I think, chat and send questions to the whoever is presenting there, because I think it's all pre-recorded sessions. That's how they do it.
Oh yeah, yeah, you're right. Because Lewis, who's one of the co-founders, was saying he was conducting several interviews, fireside chats. That's
Yeah,
nice. Yeah. Uh, we're just about ready to close. I just want to say that Ruhi put in the chat that the training and the webinars were very useful. Well, I'm delighted to hear that. What we do is we try to make open source smoother. We're lifting infrastructure. We're not the superstars. We don't get the credit, but we help make sure that everything runs smoothly. And I'm delighted to hear that the stuff our community built has helped you. And I'm looking forward, welcome to our community. I'm looking forward to building things in collaboration with you in the future. All of your feedback and ideas are tremendously valuable. Same goes to everyone else. And I'll see you next time in 2 weeks, North America Asia call, which, given that I'm based in Asia, will be at a sensible time for me and a horrible time for Yari in Europe. Take care. Talk to you soon.
ciao, ciao.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed.